Somewhere in a drawer, you have a pay stub with two numbers that never match. Near the top sits the wage you earned. Near the bottom sits the money that actually reached your hands. The gap between them is not an accident, and it is not old. It has a birthday, a Thursday in the summer of 1943. But here's the strange part. America built the machine that opened that gap, then killed it on purpose. Built it again and killed it again. It surrendered for good, only under total war. We tell this story as a rate, as a percentage argued over in Congress. That is the wrong lens. The thing that quietly made the modern federal government possible was never the size of the tax. What mattered was the moment the money moves. Withholding is the machine that takes your share before it ever lands in your palm. And a tax you never hold turns out to be a tax you find remarkably hard to miss. To see how radical it really was, you have to go back to a country that could barely collect a tax at all. For roughly its first 70 years, the federal government lived on tariffs and excise taxes. The money came in at the docks, collected from importers as crates of goods came off the ships, and it was baked invisibly into the price of ordinary things like a bottle of whiskey. A farmer in Ohio, a shopkeeper in Boston, a school teacher in Georgia could live an entire life and die of old age without once meeting a federal tax collector face to face. For generation after generation, the overwhelming share of the money that ran the entire federal government arrived this way, through the customs houses at the great ports and the excise stamps on a small handful of goods. It was a government funded largely by trade and by drink. For decades, the single custom house on the New York waterfront collected the lion's share of all the customs duties the nation took in. That was not an oversight. The men who wrote the Constitution had watched a revolution catch fire over taxation, and they built a wall against it. Direct taxes, the rule said, had to be apportioned among the states by population, which made a national tax on incomes almost impossible to design and practice. In plain terms, a poorer state and a richer state with the same headcount would owe the same total, which for a tax on incomes produced results so tangled and unequal that lawmakers rarely even tried. The country had been born from a tax revolt, and it wrote its fear of taxes into its founding law. And when the young government did reach into people's lives directly, it learned how much that fear still burned. In the 1790s, Alexander Hamilton pushed through an excise on distilled spirits, and out on the western frontier, where whiskey was money and the tax felt like tyranny wearing a new coat, farmers answered with fists and torches and tar. The trouble grew until President George Washington himself rode out in 1794 at the head of an army of about 13,000 militia to put it down. Remember that image, a president on horseback leading an army to collect a tax on liquor. It tells you exactly how far this country once was from trimming money out of every paycheck in the land. The first death of that idea, and its first strange birth, came with the cannon fire of the Civil War. Wars are expensive, and the Union needed money faster than tariffs could supply it. So in the Revenue Act of 1862, signed on July 1st of that year, Congress created the first federal income tax in the nation's history. 3% on incomes from $600 up to $10,000, 5% on the fortunes above that. The same law built the office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the direct ancestor of the agency you know today as the IRS. Buried in that act was something that would not return for 80 years. The government taxed the salaries of its own officials at the source, holding back the money before it was ever paid out. That was America's first taste of paycheck withholding, born in wartime, generations ahead of its time. Even the president was not exempt. Abraham Lincoln paid income tax on his salary in the White House. The apparatus that collected it was built almost from nothing by the first Commissioner of Internal Revenue, a former Massachusetts governor named George Boutwell. And as the fighting dragged on and the bills climbed, Congress raised the rates again in 1864, reaching as high as 10% on the biggest fortunes, so that for a few years a real slice of the Union's revenue came straight from the pockets of its own citizens. But the machine did not survive the peace. As the war receded, so did the appetite for the tax that funded it. The withholding on federal salaries was stripped out in 1864, and the income tax itself was allowed to die in 1872, repealed and buried. No court struck it down, and no mob rose against it. It was allowed to lapse, its purpose spent along with the war that had summoned it into being. The country had built the engine, run it hard for a decade, and dismantled it. Tried once, killed once. For most Americans, the government went back to being an invisible presence at the docks and the whiskey barrel, and paychecks stayed whole. The idea would not stay buried, because the old system favored the wrong people. Tariffs raised the price of everyday goods. which means they land hardest on the family that spends most of what it earns. While the great Gilded Age fortunes, the railroad and steel and banking money, went comparatively lightly taxed, reformers wanted the income tax back precisely because it could reach wealth that tariffs could not. In 1894, Congress passed one, and the Supreme Court struck it down. In Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, decided in 1895 by a single vote, 5-4, the justices ruled that a tax on income from property was a direct tax, and so it ran headlong into that old constitutional wall requiring apportionment among the states. The reformers did something audacious in response. If the Constitution stood in the way, they would change the Constitution. It took years of state-by-state ratification, but in 1913 the 16th Amendment became law, and it did one clean thing. It let Congress tax incomes from whatever source without spreading that burden across the states according to their head counts. The wall was gone. And here comes the second birth and the second death. The income tax that arrived in 1913 was almost gentle. It started at 1% on income above a $3,000 exemption, and that exemption was enormous for its day, worth something like $85,000 in today's money, which meant the ordinary wage earner owed nothing at all. The rate climbed only for the wealthy, reaching 7% on the largest incomes, those above $500,000. Out of a country of nearly 100 million people, only a few 100,000 of them owed a single cent. Tucked inside that new law was the old temptation once more. Withholding at the source. Employers and banks were told to hold back the tax before paying out wages and dividends. They hated it. The paperwork was brutal, the objections were loud, and Treasury itself eventually urged Congress to scrap it. So Congress did. In 1916 and 1917, lawmakers repealed collection at the source and replaced it with something far weaker, mere reporting at the source, where the payer told the government what it had paid but sent along no money, tried twice, killed twice. The aversion held even under the strain of another war. When the United States entered the First World War, income tax rates exploded, and the top rate climbed all the way to 77% by 1918. Yet even that enormous wartime appetite for revenue did not tempt Congress to bring withholding back. Taking the money at the source had been rejected so thoroughly that a global war could not revive it. For the next quarter century, paying the income tax was a private, deliberate act. The handful of Americans who owed it sat down with pen and paper, worked out what they owed themselves, and paid it by hand in a lump. The deadline was not April, it was March 15th, and people literally stood in line at the collector's office, checkbook in hand, to settle up. The tax was a thing you did, consciously and all at once, and you felt every dollar of it leave. That is the world that existed on the eve of the change. So how did a country this allergic to withholding come to accept it without a fight? The answer arrives first through a different door. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, and beginning with the first collections in 1937, a payroll tax was pulled directly out of tens of millions of paychecks. Here was withholding, the practice employers had beaten back twice, suddenly operating on a national scale. And there was no rebellion, no militia riding out this time. The reason is the whole secret. The money was never sold to the public as a tax. It was sold as a contribution to your own account, money set aside for your future, tracked under a personal number that the government issued to you, the Social Security number you still carry in your wallet today. It began as nothing more than a bookkeeping device, a way to keep each worker's account straight, and it became one of the most permanent identifiers in American life. Framing did what force never could. You can see the whole magic trick in a single life. Her name was Ida Mae Fuller, a legal secretary from the mill town of Ludlow, Vermont. On an errand in the autumn of 1939, she happened to pass the government office in nearby Rutland and stepped inside on a whim to ask what this Social Security business was about, never once dreaming she would end up first in line for the entire country. Over about 3 years of work before she retired, she paid a grand total of $24.75 in Social Security taxes. Then, in early 1940, she opened her mailbox and found a piece of American history. The very first monthly Social Security benefit check ever issued, numbered 000000001, dated January 31, 1940, made out to her for $22.54. She had nearly earned back everything she paid in with that first check alone. And Ida Mae Fuller lived to be 100 years old. By the time she died, she had collected a total of $22,888.92. The country had accepted money vanishing from its paychecks because it had been taught to see that money not as loss but as saving. Then came the collision that changed everything. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor, and the United States plunged into the most expensive war it had ever fought. The numbers are hard to hold. Before the war, the entire annual federal budget ran around $9 billion. The war itself would cost more than $300 billion. The government needed revenue on a scale the old class-based income tax could not begin to provide. So the Revenue Act of 1942 slashed exemptions, raised rates, and reached down into the working population for the first time. It added a flat 5% victory tax on income above $624 a year, a threshold so low it swept in ordinary wage earners by the millions. The same law cut the personal exemption for a married couple from $1,500 down to $1,200, a change that by itself pulled roughly 15 million new taxpayers onto the rolls. At the top of the scale, the rates on the wealthiest climbed to heights that look almost unreal today, with the highest bracket eventually reaching 94%. The income tax stopped being something a few million wealthy Americans paid and became something tens of millions of ordinary people owed. Historians call it the shift from a class tax to a mass tax. Fewer than 4 million income tax returns were filed in 1939. By 1945, that number had climbed past 40 million. And crucially, that new victory tax carried its own paycheck withholding, beginning in January of 1943. The pipe was laid. The only question left was whether the entire income tax would be made to flow through it. There was a practical problem first. You were about to have tens of millions of brand new taxpayers, most of whom had never filled out a tax form in their lives, and you needed them to understand and comply. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau turned to an unlikely ally for that job, Walt Disney. In a short film called The New Spirit, released in 1942, Donald Duck listens to his radio, learns it is his patriotic duty to pay his income tax, and hurries to fill out his 1040 and race it across the country to Washington. A sequel followed in 1943, pressing the same cheerful message. Tens of millions of Americans watched these cartoons in their local theaters, and a Gallup poll afterward found that 37% of those who saw the film said it affected their willingness to pay. The songwriter Irving Berlin even wrote a morale tune about doing your patriotic duty at tax time. There was a flash of public grumbling when word got out that the Treasury had paid Disney to make the cartoon, but the strategy worked all the same. The film reached theaters just ahead of the March deadline, and it helped turn a fresh national grievance into something closer to a national joke. The government was not just taxing a nation of first-timers. It was teaching them to feel good about it. But teaching people to pay did not solve the ugliest wrinkle of all. The income tax was still paid a full year in arrears on last year's earnings. So in 1943, all those millions of new taxpayers were staring down a nightmare. They would owe their entire 1942 tax bill in cash, and at the very same time they would be starting to pay on their 1943 income. 2 full years of tax crammed into 1 year of earning. It threatened to be a financial catastrophe for ordinary families, and into that crisis walked a most unusual salesman. His name was Beardsley Ruml, and he lived from 1894 to 1960. By day he was the treasurer of R.H. Extrafy, Macy & Company, the great department store, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He held a doctorate in psychology from the University of Chicago, and he liked to describe himself as an ideas man who did his best thinking lying down on a couch. His plan was pure merchant's instinct. No store on earth, he pointed out, makes you finish paying off last year's purchases before it will sell you this year's winter coat. So do the same thing with taxes. Move every American onto paying as they go in the current year through withholding, and simply forgive the old year that was hanging over their heads. He had a slogan-ready picture for it. Treat it like daylight saving time. Just turn the tax clocks forward 1 year and let 1942 fall off the calendar for good. Early in 1943, he carried that pitch straight to the public, laying out his pay-as-you-go plan for a national radio audience in the plain language of a man who sold coats and furniture for a living. One small telling detail belongs here. When the Senate Finance Committee held its withholding hearing in August of 1942, 2 men testified about the mechanics of it. One was Beardsley Ruml. The other was a young Treasury economist named Milton Friedman. Remember that name. Ruml's plan was popular, and it was also a genuine problem, because forgiving a whole year of taxes hands the biggest gift to whoever owes the most. Roosevelt and Morgenthau fought it hard on exactly that ground. A Treasury memo showed that a wealthy man in the top bracket could come out hundreds of thousands of dollars ahead under full forgiveness, while a factory worker saved very little. The president condemned it in a public letter as an inequitable distribution of the cost of the war and an unjust and discriminatory enrichment of the well-off. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Robert Doughton, called that transition the most hateful, difficult problem that ever came along in the annals of mankind. On the House floor, the whiplash showed how raw the politics had become. On a single day in late March, the House first adopted the full Ruml plan, 199 to 188, then reversed itself within hours and voted it back down, 215 to 198. Nobody could quite decide how much of the old year to erase. Treasury's own committee had warned in writing that the country could not afford at such a critical hour to forgive $10 billion of taxes already owed. And so the fight ground on through Congress. The House passed a version forgiving 60% of the old year, 313 to 95, on May 4th. The Senate backed the fuller Ruml plan, 49 to 30, on May 14th. And finally, a compromise cleared the House, 257 to 114, on June 1st, after Doughton himself changed his vote to break the deadlock. Now here is where fairness demands something, because the honest verdict is that both sides were right. Morgenthau was right, that forgiveness favored the rich, and Ruml was right that once you had continuous withholding running, the so-called lost year was mostly an accounting illusion, and the government's cash flow would actually be stronger than ever. The resolution came on June 9, 1943, when Franklin Roosevelt signed the current Tax Payment Act into law. This part is easy to confuse with a different moment. Roosevelt did veto a tax bill with a famous, stinging line about relief for the greedy rather than the needy, but that was a separate fight over rates, months later, in early 1944, and Congress overrode that veto. The bill that concerns us here, the one that rebuilt withholding and forgave the year, is the one Roosevelt signed gladly. And the deal inside it was this. Pay-as-you-go became permanent, with 20% of every wage withheld starting the 1st of July. And to solve the doubling up nightmare, 75% of 1 year's tax liability, the lower of your 1942 or 1943 bill, was canceled. If your tax came to $50 or less, it was wiped out entirely. The unforgiven remainder, that last 25%, was spread across two payments due March 15th of 1944 and 1945. For the vast majority of ordinary Americans, an entire year of federal income tax more or less legally disappeared. It is the only time in the history of the country that such a thing has ever happened. Then, on the 1st of July, 1943, the machine switched on. Overnight, every employer in America became an unpaid agent of the federal government, calculating and forwarding the income tax of the entire workforce. No one paid the employers for the service. Every payroll clerk in the country was conscripted into the machinery of federal finance, and they have never been released from that duty since. Tens of millions of people opened their next pay envelope and found the number inside permanently smaller than what they had earned. Think back to that scene from the frontier, a president in the saddle at the head of 13,000 militia, riding out over a tax on whiskey. This same country now absorbed the single largest expansion of direct taxation in its history, in the middle of an ordinary work week. And it mostly just shrugged. The journalist David Brinkley later put his finger on why. The very phrase take-home pay entered the American language in these years, because for the first time, your pay came home to you already reduced. And Brinkley's deeper observation was that, without the war, Congress would almost certainly never have dared to pass a tax so intrusive. The emergency made acceptable what peace never could. Some of the men who built the machinery understood exactly what they had made, and a few were uneasy about it. The withholding system was engineered inside Treasury's Division of Tax Research by a small team that included that young economist from the Senate hearing, Milton Friedman, then about 30 years old. Decades later, Friedman would become the most famous champion of small government the century produced. A relentless critic of a federal state he considered too large, too intrusive, too corrosive of individual freedom. And he wrote, with real regret, that it had simply never occurred to him at the time that he was helping to build the very engine that would make such a government possible. He defended the work as a wartime necessity, which it was, but he regretted for the rest of his life that when the war ended, the machine was never switched back off. Because that is exactly what happened. When peace came, withholding. The idea America had killed twice simply stayed. Its effect on the size of the federal government is hard to overstate. Individual income tax went from taking about 1% of Americans' personal income in 1939 to more than 11% within a few short years, an 11-fold jump accomplished with less public fury than a whiskey tax had provoked in the 1790s. Withholding changed more than how much people paid. It changed which tax carried the country. Before the war, the government's single largest source of money had been excise taxes on ordinary goods like gasoline and tobacco. Within a few years, the individual income tax overtook them all to become the #1 source of federal revenue, and by 1944 it alone was generating close to $2 out of every $5 Washington collected. It has never surrendered that top rank since. A broader figure captures what truly shifted. Before the war, federal revenue amounted to well under 1/10 of the entire national economy. By the last year of the fighting, it had roughly tripled as a share of that economy, and here's the part that lasted. It never fell back. The elevated level the war made possible became the permanent floor of American government, and it has held there ever since. There is a final piece of psychology in how it stuck. Withholding tables are set to pull a little too much just to be safe, which means most workers reach the end of the year having overpaid. So the emotional climax of the tax year quietly flipped. It used to be the pain of writing a big check every March. Now it is the small burst of joy in spring when a refund arrives in the mailbox. And yet you have lent the government your own money all year long at no interest, and when a piece of it is handed back you feel gratitude. A typical refund today runs somewhere around $3,000, and to many it feels like a gift rather than a return of what was always theirs. So what was really invented in 1943? It was never a rate, and it was never even the tax. It was the removal of the moment you feel the tax leave your hands. And the man who made that removal palatable said the quiet part out loud a few years later. In a 1946 essay drawn from a speech to the American Bar Association titled "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete," Beardsley Ruml argued that a modern national government, one with its own central bank and its own currency, does not actually need taxes in order to fund itself at all. Taxes, he wrote, are really instruments of policy. Tools to curb inflation, to redistribute wealth, to steer behavior. Government, in his telling, taxed not to fill its own purse, but to shape the country around it, draining off spending power when prices threaten to run wild, moving wealth from one set of hands into another, rewarding some choices and quietly penalizing others. Whatever you make of that claim, and reasonable people have argued it fiercely for 80 years, it sharpens the one question this whole story leaves sitting on the table. When the cost of government is something you never actually feel, who gets to decide how large that cost becomes? For 154 years, from the founding to that Thursday in 1943, Americans argue that question out loud in tax revolts and Supreme Court fights and lines at the collector's office. Since July 1st, 1943, it has been answered quietly, line by line, on a pay stub almost no one bothers to read. The fair place to leave this is not on a verdict, but on an honest ledger, because both halves of the story are true. The same machine that made the cost of government nearly invisible also funded the defeat of fascism, sent a generation of veterans to college on the GI Bill, laid the interstate highways under your tires, and let a family with no savings pay its fair share a little at a time instead of all at once. Withholding built things worth building, and withholding made the state easier to grow, and its price easier to overlook. If you found this the kind of history worth your time, the kind that trusts you with the whole picture rather than half of it, subscribe and the next story will be waiting. The next time your pay lands smaller than you earned, you will know the machine behind it, and you will know it has a birthday.